Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Welcome. Good. Welcome to our continuing class on the Bhagavad Gita. We begin our study of Chapter 3 today. Chapter 2 took quite a while. It was a very important, fundamental chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, also one of the longest. So we took our time. We finished Chapter 3. Before I introduce Chapter 3, let's begin with our recitation. As always, as I'm chanting, glance at the translation and then repeat after me. Arjuna vacha, Arjuna vacha, jayasi chet karmanaste, jayasi chet karmanaste, mata buddhir janardana, mata buddhir janardana, tat kim karmani ghore mam, tat kim karmani ghore mam, niyojayasi keshava, niyojayasi keshava, vyamishreneva vakyena, vyamishreneva vakyena, buddhim mohayasiva me, buddhim mohayasiva me, tadekam vara nishchitya, tadekam vara nishchitya, yena shreyohamapnuyam, yena shreyohamapnuyam. Shri Bhagavanu vacha, Shri Bhagavanu vacha, lokesmin dvividha nishtha, lokesmin dvividha nishtha, pura prokta maya nagha, pura prokta maya nagha, jnana yogena sankhyanam, jnana yogena sankhyanam, karma yogena yoginam, karma yogena yoginam. Na karma namanarambhan, na karma namanarambhan, naishkarmyam purushoshnute, naishkarmyam purushoshnute, nacha sanyasanadeva, nacha sanyasanadeva, siddhim samadhigacchati, siddhim samadhigacchati, nahi kaschit kshanamapi, nahi kaschit kshanamapi, jatu tishtatya karma krita, jatu tishtatya karma krita, karyate hyavashah karma, karyate hyavashah karma, sarva prakriti jargunaihi, sarva prakriti jargunaihi, karmendriyani samyamya, karmendriyani samyamya, yahaste manasa smaran, yahaste manasa smaran, indriyarthan vimudhatma, indriyarthan vimudhatma, mityachara sauchyate, mityachara sauchyate, yastvindriyani manasa, yastvindriyani manasa, niyam yarabhatirjuna, niyam yarabhatirjuna, karmendriyai karma yogam, karmendriyai karma yogam, asakta savishishyate, asakta savishishyate, niyatam kuru karmatvam, niyatam kuru karmatvam, karma jyo hya karmanaha, karma jyo hya karmanaha, sharira yatra pichate, sharira yatra pichate, na prasidhyera karmanaha, na prasidhyera karmanaha. Very good. Now, to introduce this chapter, you notice that the chapter began with Arjuna's question about karma and knowledge. And to properly introduce Arjuna's question, we have to go back to chapter 2 and see the basis for Arjuna's question. And that basis was not merely these, I'm going to show you two verses, but these two verses are representative of two issues that Arjuna is contemplating in his mind and confused about. The first one, karmajam buddhi yukta hi palam tyaktva manishinaha. Manishinaha, a person who palam tyaktva gives up the fruits of actions and is buddhi yukta hi, is endowed with buddhi. Remember, here it means karma yoga buddhi, the attitude of a karma yogi, the attitude that nothing in the world can be accomplished through your ordinary actions that will result in perfect contentment and peace. Therefore, those karmas, the phala of those karmas, the fruits of those karmas are not what's important. For the karma yogi, what's important is following dharma without being driven for the limited results of those actions. And such karma yogis, janma bandha vinirmuktaha, are freed from the bondage of birth and rebirth, param gachanti anamayam. And they reach a param, a state or condition, which is anamayam, free from suffering. So in this verse, verse 51, Sri Krishna extols the value of karma yoga. Karma yoga being one of several topics in the chapter. You might remember that after teaching karma yoga, Sri Krishna took up another topic in response to Arjuna's question about how does a wise person walk and talk, etc. Sri Krishna began to describe the nature of an enlightened person. And he did so with a number of verses, but he concluded the chapter with this verse, Esha Brahmi Sthiti Partad. O Arjuna, this is Brahmi Sthiti, this is a status, this is a state of being established in Brahman, absolute reality. Na enam prapya vimuhyati. Having gained this state of absorption in Brahman, one never again becomes confused. Stitva, and remaining in this state, asyam antakalepi, even at the end of one's life, when you die, brahma nirvanam ruchati, that person gains brahma nirvanam. We had a long discussion about that word, nirvana, being extinguished, being absorbed, being merged into Brahman. So the prior verse extolled the value of karma yoga. This verse obviously extols the value of being enlightened. And these two factors are what leads to Arjuna's question, where, and we'll see the verse now, Arjuna vacha, jayasi chet karmanaste, jayasi chet karmanaste, mata buddhir janardana, mata buddhir janardana, tat kim karmani ghore mam, tat kim karmani ghore mam, niyojayasi keshava, niyojayasi keshava. In the second line, Arjuna is addressed as Janardana, and I'm amused that commentators come up with two opposite meanings for that name, because Ardana can either mean worship, or Ardana can be afflicting, worshiping or afflicting. So Janardana is either is either one who is worshipped, respected, honored by people, or one who afflicts people. And this is the nature of Sanskrit. Sanskrit having such a wide vocabulary, it allows for various meanings. And you can't say one meaning is right and one meaning is wrong. They're both right, and they're both meaningful. Okay, enough said. So here, Arjuna opens chapter 3, the chapter entitled Karma Yoga, by addressing Krishna and saying, Chet, if, connect the words at the end of the first line, te, your, mata, your opinion. Chet te mata, if it's your opinion, if you consider buddhihi, buddhi here means knowledge, and buddhi here does not mean what buddhi meant in chapter 2, and I'm sorry, but we have to deal with these language issues. Of course, if you allow me a bit of a sarcastic joke, and maybe there's some benefit in not knowing Sanskrit, because there are so many details, you can get hung up with those details. If you have a proper translation or a proper teacher, you'll get the right meaning, so it's okay. Remember, buddhi in chapter 2 meant attitude, specifically the attitude of karma yoga. But here, buddhi means knowledge, knowledge in the sense of enlightenment. The last of the two verses we just saw, that Brahmi sthiti, being established in Brahman. This is Atma Jnanam, Brahma Jnanam, knowledge of Atma, knowledge of Brahman. It is enlightenment. And here Arjuna refers to that condition of being enlightened with the word buddhi. So Sri Krishna that used the word buddhi to mean attitude in the prior chapter. Here it's not Sri Krishna using the word, but rather Arjuna using the word with a different meaning. So buddhi here means enlightenment. So chet, if, te mata, if it is your opinion that buddhi, spiritual wisdom, knowledge, enlightenment, jayasi, in the first line, is better than karmanaha, is better than karma. Karma, in the context of the prior chapter, is not merely doing action. Karma means action. But in the context of the prior chapter, karma here means karma yoga. It means doing action with the attitudes that convert action into a kind of spiritual practice. We discussed that at some length. We're going to come back to that topic, by the way. Obviously, this chapter is called Karma Yoga, so we would expect more discussion about Karma Yoga. But that's not what we begin with. So Arjuna's question here in the first half is chet, if, te mata, if it is your contention, Janardana, the one who's worshipped by people, or the one who afflicts people. Both meanings. O Krishna, if it is your contention that buddhi, spiritual wisdom, jayasi, is better than karmanaha, is better than karma yoga, is better than acting with the attitude taught in the prior chapter, tatkim, then why me, karmani gore niyojayasi. Then why niyojayasi? Why do you compel me, niyojayasi? Why do you compel me, karmani ghore, in this ghora karma, in this terrible karma, in this terrible deed, the deed, of course, of fighting the war. And not just fighting the war, but fighting against and killing his own family members. Keshava, O Krishna, why, I'll paraphrase, if you consider spiritual wisdom to be better than karma yoga, then why are you telling me to do karma yoga here on the battlefield, to stay on the battlefield and fight with the attitudes you've taught? Remember, at the beginning of chapter 2, this is important to set the whole context of Arjuna's question, and that is, at the beginning of chapter 2, Arjuna briefly considered the possibility of running away from the battlefield and taking to the life of sannyasa, the life of a Hindu monk. He said, Shreyo bhoktum bhaikshyam. Arjuna said, this is in verse 5 of chapter 2. Arjuna said, it would be best for me to live a life of bhaikshyam, to live a life of alms, to live a life of begging, to renounce worldly life, to leave the battlefield, and live the life of a sannyasi. So this is very much on Arjuna's mind. And to Arjuna, Arjuna thinks that the way you gain spiritual wisdom is by leaving the world and living as a sannyasi, by renouncing the world and becoming a Hindu monk. To Arjuna, karma yoga doesn't seem like a reasonable way to get enlightened. Of course, Sri Krishna is going to explain in great detail, first in chapter 3, then even more in chapter 4, and even further in chapter 5, Sri Krishna is going to say very, very powerfully and clearly how karma yoga is a essential preparatory step on the path of spiritual growth. That is, without karma yoga, you cannot proceed to the following stages of spiritual growth, and finally gaining spiritual wisdom, what Sri Krishna calls here, what Arjuna calls here, buddhi. So Arjuna is confused here, and actually there are two kinds of confusion. Let me make those two kinds of confusion clear before we proceed. One kind of confusion, so Arjuna says, which do you consider better? Do you consider, he says, O Krishna, you seem to, you consider buddhi, spiritual wisdom, better than karma yoga. Remember those two verses we just saw? The first of the two verses was karma yoga, which is a spiritual practice. The second of those two verses was about enlightenment. So with that in mind, Sri Krishna considers enlightenment better than karma yoga. Well, karma yoga is the means, and enlightenment is the goal, the end. And the end, the goal, is always superior to the means. As a silly example, what is better, cooking a meal or eating the meal? Now, everyone would prefer cooking eating the meal. Cooking the meal can be a lot of hard work. It can take hours and hours for some dishes. So people would generally say that eating the meal is better than cooking the meal. That's what Sri Krishna is saying here. That's what Sri Krishna said at the end of chapter 2, where he extolled enlightenment. Enlightenment is better than karma yoga because enlightenment is the goal, whereas karma yoga is only a means to that end. So here's the first of Arjuna's two kinds of confusion. He says, O Krishna, if you consider enlightenment better than karma yoga, he uses the word buddhi. meaning spiritual wisdom. But this spiritual wisdom is not different than being enlightened. When you have this particular spiritual wisdom, you become enlightened. So to paraphrase Arjuna, Arjuna would say then, "O Krishna, if you consider being enlightened better than karma yoga," well, of course Sri Krishna is going to consider, anyone would consider enlightenment, the goal, to be better than karma yoga, which is a means to that end. So that's the first of Arjuna's two kinds of confusion. The second of the two kinds of confusion is a common conclusion that Arjuna has made. Not just Arjuna, but even up to modern times, people continually make this wrong conclusion. And the conclusion is the way to become enlightened is to renounce the world, become a monk, and spend your days completely absorbed in meditation and spiritual study. And Arjuna also has that idea in his mind, and to the extent that, as I said in chapter 2, he considered leaving the battlefield and renouncing the world and taking to the life of a sannyasi. So Arjuna, his second kind of confusion is if spiritual wisdom, and I have to paraphrase quite extensively here, if spiritual wisdom is better than karma yoga, as it certainly is, the end is better than the means, the goal is better than the means. So if spiritual wisdom is better than karma yoga, and spiritual wisdom is best achieved by renouncing the world and dedicating yourself exclusively to spiritual study and meditation, then he asked Sri Krishna, "Why do you want me to stay here on this battlefield and fight this terrible, terrible war?" So this is Arjuna's second kind of confusion. And Sri Krishna is going to address both of them in this chapter. He's going to start out by addressing that confusion about thinking that you have to become a sannyasi, a Hindu monk, and renounce the world in order to become enlightened. So we'll see that in two more verses. But Arjuna's question continues for one more verse. His question continues, Vyamishreneva vakyena, Vyamishreneva vakyena, Buddhim mohayasiva me, Buddhim mohayasiva me, Tarekam vara nishchitya, Tarekam vara nishchitya, Yena shreyoham apnuyam, Yena shreyoham apnuyam. In the second line, Me buddhim mohayasi eva. Me buddhim, my mind. Here's buddhi again with yet a different meaning. So here buddhi means mind or intellect. Me buddhim, my mind, my intellect. Mohayasi, you confuse. And then just to soften it, mohayasi eva. Arjuna adds that word. You as though confuse my word. He doesn't want to accuse Sri Krishna of being deliberately confusing. So you seem to confuse my mind. How? In the first line, vakyena, with this statement, with these teachings, everything taught in chapter 2, which are vyamishrena eva. There's that eva word again, which are as though vyamishrena, vyamishra, mixed up in a sense of confused. So that's Arjuna's confusion. In chapter 2, Sri Krishna praised karma yoga, and he also praised the spiritual wisdom that culminates in enlightenment. So Arjuna thinks this is confusing. These two different things are praised, therefore it's confusing. Of course, it's a little bit like praising the cook who cooks the meal and praising the meal that you eat enjoyed. Both are praiseworthy. So Arjuna's question is based on his confusion. Arjuna's question is not based on Sri Krishna's confusion. Sri Krishna is not confused. Arjuna is. So he says in the third line, Tadekam vada nishchitya. Tadekam, that one, vada, tell me that one, nishchitya, certainly, with certainty. Tell me that one with certainty, that one, yena, by which shreyas, the highest goal. And the highest goal in the context of the Bhagavad Gita is gaining enlightenment. Shreyas could mean other things in other contexts, but here it means gaining enlightenment. So tell me, Vada, tell me tadekam, that one thing, yena, by which shreyas, the highest goal, aham apnuyam, aham, I, apnuyam, would achieve. I would achieve shreyas. Tell me that one by which I achieve the highest goal. That one what? Arjuna left that out, presuming that Sri Krishna would understand. And in Arjuna's mind, it's very clear. In fact, in Sri Krishna's mind, it's very clear. Arjuna is thinking, which one path will lead me to the highest goal? Will the path of karma yoga lead me to the highest goal? And in this context, the path of karma yoga means remaining on the battlefield and fighting this bloody war. And the other path for Arjuna, Arjuna thinks the other path is leaving the battlefield, renouncing the world, dedicating himself to a life of spiritual growth, and spending the rest of his days in meditation and spiritual study, living the life of a sannyasi, a Hindu monk. So for Arjuna, these are the two options. Of course, Sri Krishna is going to make it very clear that they're really not two options. We'll let Sri Krishna explain that. So Arjuna says, which path will lead me to the highest goal? By staying on the battlefield and practicing karma yoga, or by renouncing the world and dedicating myself to spiritual growth? This is Arjuna's question, to which Sri Krishna responds. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Lokesmin Dvividha Nishtha, Lokesmin Dvividha Nishtha, Pura Prukta Mayanagha, Pura Prukta Mayanagha, Jnana Yogena Sankhyanam, Jnana Yogena Sankhyanam, Karma Yogena Yoginam, Karma Yogena Yoginam. Shri Krishna says, Asmin loke, in this world, dvividha nishtha. There are dvividha, two kinds of nishtha. Best translation of nishtha here is lifestyle. I see I've translated here two paths, and path is in the sense of a path of spiritual growth. And path of spiritual growth means a lifestyle that you adopt for the sake of spiritual growth. And this is what Arjuna's question is, and this is what Sri Krishna is addressing. Arjuna is asking, is it better for me to live a life of karma yoga? And the term we often use for that is a life of a grihastha. Grihastha means householder, someone who lives a conventional worldly life, raising a family and fulfilling worldly dharmas, as opposed to the lifestyle of a sannyasi. Sannyasi means one who has renounced worldly life. for the sake of dedicating himself or herself exclusively to spiritual activities. So, dvividha nishtha, there are two paths, two kinds of lifestyle, which were prokta, which were described, pura, long ago. These were described, and here's an interesting word, maya, Sri Krishna says. They were described maya, by me, pura, long ago. And here is one of many, many places in the Bhagavad Gita where Sri Krishna refers to himself not as Arjuna's charioteer, but Arjuna refers to himself as an avatara, as an incarnation of God, of Vishnu. Sri Krishna refers to himself in this as Ishvara, as God. So these two lifestyles were prokta maya. They were described by me, pura, long ago, anagha, O sinless one, O Arjuna. And what are those two paths? What are the two lifestyles? One is jnana yogena sankhyanam. You can jnana yogena, by the practice of jnana yoga. And jnana yoga means the single pointed pursuit of spiritual growth to the extent of renouncing all conventional worldly activities. So jnana yoga has different meanings in different contexts. So often the term jnana yoga is used to refer to Vedanta in general, the pursuit of knowledge. But here the term jnana yoga is used in a different sense, in a very narrow sense. Jnana yoga here is the exclusive pursuit of spiritual wisdom. And by exclusive, we mean renouncing the world. And who is this kind of activity for? Sankhyanam, for the followers of Sankhya. And this is a little bit of archaic vocabulary. In Arjuna and Sri Krishna's time, Sankhya was actually the term Sankhya. In fact, we saw it in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called Sankhya Yoga. And if you remember, in Chapter 2, the term Sankhya meant jnanam, knowledge. So here, Sankhyanam, for those who practice Sankhya, and loosely speaking, for those who pursue knowledge, for those who pursue knowledge exclusively, meaning for those who are monks, sannyasis. So Sankhyanam means sannyasinam, for those who have renounced the world. So there are two paths Sri Krishna describes. One path, Sankhyanam, the path for those who have renounced worldly activities, is jnana yoga, the path of exclusively pursuing knowledge. And the other path, karma yogena yoginam, the other path is karma yoga, which we've just discussed at some length, yoginam, and here yogi means karma yogi. So karma yoginam, for practitioners of karma yoga. Who are those practitioners of karma yoga? Those who haven't renounced the world. This is the basic division. Those who have renounced worldly life and those who haven't renounced worldly life. And Sri Krishna makes a very obvious distinction. For those who have renounced worldly life, they can exclusively pursue knowledge, spiritual wisdom, and yoginam, for those who have not for those who have not renounced worldly life, they practice karma yoga. Notice both are pursuing moksha with equal intensity, and we're going to have this discussion at some length here. So let me introduce the discussion. It is not true that one who has renounced the world is able more effectively to pursue moksha. It's so often this assumption is made that a sannyasi, a Hindu monk, is someone who, by virtue of the fact that they've renounced worldly activities, they are further along on the spiritual path, or even they've reached the end of the spiritual path merely because of their dress, merely because of their lifestyle. Sri Krishna is going to completely refute that conclusion. The conclusion that someone who has renounced the world is somehow more advanced. So in fact, we'll see in the very next verse how Sri Krishna refutes the notion that someone who has renounced worldly life is more advanced on the spiritual path. Let's see that. Na karma namanarambhan, na karma namanarambhan, naishkarmyam purushoshnute, naishkarmyam purushoshnute, na cha sanyasnadeva, na cha sanyasanadeva, siddhim samadhigacchati, siddhim samadhigacchati. He absolutely refutes that idea that renunciation is somehow superior, and he says, na, let's see, in the second line, the subject of the sentence is in the second line, Purusha, a person. A person, na karmanam anarambhat. By the way, that anarambhan, that nasal at the end, is a result of a grammatical change. So anarambhat, by failing to undertake action, by failing to engage in karmanam, in actions, karmanam anarambhat, by refraining from becoming engaged in action, meaning by renouncing the world and going and living in a cave, metaphorically, by becoming a sannyasi, a Hindu monk, Sri Krishna says, Purusha, a person, na naishkarimyam ashnute. A person na ashnute does not experience naishkarmyam, actionlessness. And that's a fancy word, naishkarmyam, actionlessness. The idea of actionlessness, there are several levels of meaning. Let's just stay with the obvious one here. When you achieve your goal, you stop making an effort. You cease making an effort. If you have to dig a hole, when the hole is dug, you stop digging. If you have to cook a meal, when you're done cooking, you stop preparing the meal. So here, naishkarmyam, it has other meanings as well, but in this context, it means the condition of having completed all that needs to be done. A state of perfection in which you have the sense that there is nothing further to be done. This is naishkarmyam. Literally, it means actionlessness, but in this context, actionless means the feeling that everything that needs to be accomplished has been accomplished. It's a state of completion, a state of perfection, and therefore the word is used for moksha, for liberation, enlightenment. Okay. So, in fact, you could loosely translate naishkarmyam as moksha, liberation, or enlightenment. So if you substitute the word enlightenment, look what meaning you get. A person does not gain naishkarmyam, enlightenment, karmanam anarambhat, by refraining from action, by merely renouncing worldly activities, by that act alone, you don't gain enlightenment. How do you gain enlightenment? It's through spiritual wisdom, through having that veil of ignorance removed so that you can discover your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, as that divinity that dwells within. To remove the veil of ignorance requires spiritual wisdom. Now here's the point. Mere renunciation doesn't necessarily lead to spiritual wisdom. This is pretty obvious. I think in the last chapter I told the story when I was in Rishikesh going to visit that Mauni Baba, that monk who practiced silence, who was living up in the hills above Rishikesh. And if you remember that story, so I had spent the whole day traveling to meet this monk, and I had high expectations, and he lived in a cave for 10 years and didn't speak a word for 10 years. And I thought, I was excited. I was young and naive then. Anyway, when I was very excited to reach him, and if you remember the story, when I arrived, he was sitting outside his cave reading a newspaper. And I wasn't expecting that. Reading a newspaper means, what kind of renunciation is that? You go to the cave and you bring a newspaper with you. I guess in modern times you'd bring your cell phone and computer with you. That's not renunciation. But I don't think I mentioned this in the prior class, and that is there's something else I noticed. I don't know if you can see on the camera. I need to demonstrate this. I don't think I said this. So what I saw, he was reading the newspaper. Yeah, that shows good. He was reading the newspaper, and I noticed this. You've seen people do that, right? A limb is shaking constantly. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it's a physical indication of inner stress, possibly inner turmoil. Obviously, it's not relaxation and contentment. Relaxation and contentment, you'd expect to see no such motions. But his foot was vibrating like that. And now I could be completely wrong, I admit. By observing people, we don't truly know. But here's my assumption. My assumption was reading a newspaper and demonstrating some kind of inner tension or stress. He didn't strike me as being enlightened at all. He had lived in that cave for 10 years and failed to get enlightened. This is my assumption. And I could be wrong, but my assumption is that 10 years of living in the cave didn't make him enlightened. Why? Well, first of all, when you enter a cave, what do you bring with you? In this case, he brought a newspaper. But you bring with you whatever is in your mind, right? So if your mind, before entering the cave, and entering the cave is obviously symbolic of taking to a life of renunciation, a life of being a sannyasi. So if before entering the cave, his mind was full of worldly thoughts, raga and dvesha, if he was fond of tea before entering the cave, after entering the cave, he'd still be fond of tea. Maybe he wouldn't be able to drink tea as often as he used to, but he would still have that desire for tea, craving for tea. It won't go away just because he enters a cave. Further, if before he entered the cave, his true self, Atma, was covered by a veil of ignorance, he would bring that ignorance with him into the cave. That doesn't sound very good. The point is that to remove that veil of ignorance, we need proper teachings. Generally, proper teachings come from a proper teacher, a guru. By going into that cave, he isolated himself and deprived himself of an opportunity of sitting with a proper guru and undergoing this proper process of self-inquiry, atma-vichara, self-inquiry, a process which can culminate in removing that veil of ignorance and becoming enlightened. It's hard to do that in a cave if you don't have a teacher or teaching available. Now, I'll just, again, he may have been enlightened. I have no way of knowing for sure, but my impression is this. In fact, I struggle to understand how he could go on living in that cave year after year without getting enlightened. And here's what I imagine. I don't know. This is what I imagine, is as a young man, he had some exposure to spiritual teachings, and he was filled with tremendous enthusiasm for dedicating himself to a life of spiritual growth, so much enthusiasm that he was ready to leave the city or town behind, go up to Himalayas, find this little cave and establish himself in this cave. And I imagine that he must have dedicated himself to spiritual practice very intensely. Sitting in a cave, what will be your main spiritual practice? That's kind of obvious, right? So sitting in a cave, your main spiritual practice is not spiritual study. Spiritual study is what you do with a guru. He didn't have a guru with him in the spiritual cave, so spiritual study was not his main practice. Obviously, karma yoga was not his main practice. Bhakti, devotion, probably was not his main practice. There was no altar in the cave, and I could be mistaken, but clearly what was his main practice would have been meditation. Clearly, why do you go and sit in a cave? It's supposed to be a distraction-free environment which will support your practice of meditation. So I imagined, right or wrong, I imagined that as a young man, he entered that cave and immersed himself in deep meditation. Week after week, month after month, year after year, and he failed to get enlightened. Why? You've heard me joke about this before. If your mind is full of ignorance and you meditate, what are you meditating on? You can only meditate on what you know. You can't meditate on what you don't know. He went into that cave without knowing his true nature as Satchidananda Atma. So how could he meditate on Satchidananda Atma without knowing it first? That veil of ignorance remained. And this is again, I imagine he struggled, he meditated deeply, but failed to gain enlightenment. And at some point, after some number of years, he must have any intelligent person would eventually come to the conclusion that he's not going to get enlightenment by continuing to meditate in the cave. But then that would be a reasonable assumption. Certainly after 5 years or so, if 5 years of intense meditation have not made you enlightened, then 5 more years probably aren't going to make any big difference. So then why did he remain in that cave? And again, this is my presumption, and I could absolutely be wrong. But after being in that cave for 5 years meditating, coming to the conclusion that he wouldn't get enlightened in this lifetime, but then also in an Indian cultural context, once you've renounced your family, once you've renounced the possibility of getting married and starting a family, once you've renounced any kind of career path, it's hard to go back. Hard to go back to family, hard to go back and get married, hard to go back and pick up a career. So he might have concluded, again, this is all my imagination, he might have concluded it's impossible to go back, even though he won't get enlightened if he continues to meditate, at least by staying in his cave and continuing to meditate and live that austere lifestyle. How austere was it? I don't know, reading the newspaper, but anyway, living that dedicated lifestyle, he, in his mind, he might have concluded that he would go on accumulating punya karma, good karma, and through further years of accumulating good karma by continuing to live in that cave and meditate, perhaps he could get enlightened in his next life. I imagine that perhaps he came to that conclusion. I have no way of knowing. It's purely a matter of imagination. In my effort to try to understand what he was doing and why he would continue living in that cave after 10 years. But this is what Sri Krishna says here. In the first half, he says that a person, by the mere karmanam anarambhat, by the mere renunciation of action, naishkarmyam, enlightenment, na ashnute, you will not gain enlightenment. Nacha, and further, sannyasanat eva, by sannyasa alone, through renunciation alone, na samadhigacchati, you will not gain siddhim, perfection, success. In this context, moksha, enlightenment. Sri Krishna makes it so absolutely clear. By mere renunciation, you cannot gain enlightenment. Renunciation might be helpful. For some people, it's very helpful. For me, to have the privilege of living the life of a sannyasi, I have found it incredibly helpful, but that's because more than anything else, it's because I had a proper guru. I had a proper teacher. I never renounced my guru. Never. He gave me sannyasa. He initiated me into sannyasa. And I certainly didn't renounce him. I didn't renounce continued study of Vedanta. In fact, that act of renunciation allowed me to dedicate myself more intensely to a life of spiritual study, a life of meditation, etc. So it was helpful for me. Also, and the point that Sri Krishna is going to make in the next several verses is that, let me just say it now very clearly so we can see how it's developed in the following verses. According to Sri Krishna, what he's going to say is that karma yoga can prepare you for renunciation. Karma yoga is an essential step of preparation on the spiritual path. If your path is eventually going to lead to renunciation, well, you better practice karma yoga first, because without that essential preparation, you won't be able to continue. And as I said before, in chapter 3, 4, and 5, Sri Krishna is going to make this point extremely clearly, that karma yoga is an essential step of preparation for gaining enlightenment. So let's see how he begins to explain that. Sri Krishna says, Nahi kaschit kshanamapi, nahi kaschit kshanamapi, Jatu tishtatya karma krita. Jatu tishtatya karma krita. Karyate hyavasha karma. Karyate hyavasha karma. Sarva prakriti jargunaihi. Sarva prakriti jargunaihi. Nahi kaschat. Na kaschat. No one. Kshanam api. Even for a moment. Jatu, at all, tishtati, can remain akarmakrit. No one can remain, even for a moment, akarmakrit, without being engaged in action. Our Mauni Baba in the cave was reading a newspaper. Even as a sannyasi, I'm a sannyasi. I'm engaged in action right now, in the action of teaching. And what Sri Krishna is beginning to develop here is the point that action is natural. Let's see the rest of the verse. So, nahi kaschid, no one, kshanamapi, even for a moment, jatu tishtati, can ever remain a karmakrita without being engaged in some kind of action. Karyate hi avashaha karma. Sarvaha, in the next line, sarvaha, everyone. Everyone No. Sarvaha karma karyate avashaha. Everyone, karyate karma, will be engaged in some kind of action or another, avashaha, choicelessly, not a matter of choice. Everyone will be engaged choicelessly in some kind of action or another. Why? Driven because karyate, they will be compelled to perform these actions. Prakriti jaihi gunaihi, by the gunas, the qualities, which are prakriti ja, born of prakriti. The qualities born of prakriti. The gunas, or qualities he's talking about, of course, are sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva, the principle of purity, rajas, the principle of activity and passion, and tamas, the principle of darkness and lethargy. These three terms are used here to describe the nature of our minds. And our minds are driven by certain our minds. Well, Sri Krishna says it very simply. Our minds are driven by these three qualities. These three qualities are present in your mind and my mind and every person's mind, and these three qualities will compel every person's mind to be engaged in activity. Karyate sarva, karyate karma. They will compel everyone's mind to be engaged in some kind of action. Now, there's a lot to see in this chapter. I don't want to go on right now, but what Sri Krishna is going to develop in the coming verses is this. It is natural for every person to be engaged in action. After all, Ishvara created us with arms and hands and legs and a very powerful mind, and we are designed for action. But now Sri Krishna's point is, since you're designed for action, to renounce action, in a manner of speaking, is unnatural. It might be suited for certain people, I find myself to be a kind of a reclusive and contemplative person, so some kinds of renunciation might be suitable for some kind of people, but in general, people are designed, so to speak, by the Creator to be engaged in action. And Sri Krishna's point is, since you are already designed for action, since you are already inclined to be engaged in action, let that action serve as a spiritual practice. That's karma yoga, right? Since we are naturally inclined to be engaged in action, what we can do, and as we discussed in a prior chapter, is redirect that action. And when I say redirect, we're talking about the shift of motivation. And the shift of motivation, which we discussed extensively in a prior chapter, it's a shift of your actions at first are driven by desire. I want it. Driven by raga dvesha. So at first, actions are driven by raga dvesha for the sake of gaining worldly contentment. And after this conversion of attitude, brought about through the teachings of karma yoga in the Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere, as a result of this conversion of attitude, instead of your actions being driven by raga and dvesha, your actions will be driven by dharma. You will act in a way that you follow dharma. Why? That will lead you onwards on your path of spiritual growth. So instead of seeking worldly contentment, you are now seeking perfect peace and contentment by following a spiritual path which can culminate in removing that veil of ignorance, culminate in enlightenment. We'll see more in our next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Mahamritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.